Hello everyone, hello GIFCon. I am Dr. Alex Henderson, recording from Ngunnawal country. Thank you so much for watching. I'm very excited to be here. Queering the Fantastic is basically my ideal conference topic and theme, so very excited this could all be virtual and I could come virtually all the way to Glasgow to speak with you guys today. Today I am talking about the Trickster in queer young adult fiction, and specifically looking at Margaret Owen's novel Little Thieves as a case study. Today I will attempt to define the admittedly slippery figure of the trickster, map the traits and storytelling functions that make a character fit that archetype, and explore the thematic intersections that make the trickster right at home in queer young adult, or YA. For illustration, I'm going to discuss Little Thieves, which is a 2021 fantasy novel and the first in a trilogy, and most importantly, its tricksterish protagonist Vanya as an effective case study of how YA authors can play in this space and make use of this character type to tell cathartic, morally complex, and fun stories that might resonate with a young, marginalized audience. Just as a note, the illustration on the screen here is actually a pre-order bonus print for the third book in the series, Holy Terrors. I've used this because Vanya here looks particularly mischievous and mythologized, but for brevity, this presentation itself, I'll just be narrowing my focus down to just the first book, Little Thieves. Likewise, my outfit here today, I'm visually more aligned with the prefects and with the more traditional structure of justice rather than the trickster Vanya, but look, I had a cravat lying around and I took the opportunity. That's all that there is to it. So the trickster is often tricky to define. William J. Hines even suggests that the sheer richness of trickster phenomena can easily lead one to conclude that trickster is indefinable, but let's give it a shot. Trickster, as it's currently conceptualized, is a character type that derives from the work of structuralist mythographers and anthropologists working in the mid-20th century, including Paul Rodin, Claude Levi-Strauss, and Mary Douglas. However, these foundational scholars have been subject to quite a lot of critique. Later writers have especially scrutinized their tendency to homogenize cultural storytelling traditions in the name of formulating a universal cross-cultural narrative and archetype. We don't have time to unpack all of that here in this session, but it is important to acknowledge. And Anne Dohe has a chapter, it will be in my citations, that gets into this in much more detail and nuance. As I'm talking about it today, there are a few key traits that we're looking for. Shape-shifting and transformation, troublemaking and trick-playing, existing on and crossing established boundaries, whether they are social or more literal, embodying irony and paradox, for example, being simultaneously clever and foolish, breaking taboos, troubling established binaries and categories, and a sense of playful, cheeky, and inappropriate humor. Tricksters aren't necessarily bound within good or evil, and their antics can be, to quote Helena Bassel-Morozo, who is one of the scholars I'm really drawing on looking at the trickster as sort of a contemporary media archetype, tricksters can be malicious, playful, or heroic, and sometimes all three at once, she says. As well, not sitting neatly within these black and white moral codes, the trickster also never sits neatly within their story world's power structures. Because they're outside the dominant sphere, the dominant hegemonic power structure, or whatever setting they inhabit, tricksters are also uniquely positioned to question, trouble, and sometimes even break these power structures down. Consistent to most typologies is this notion that, again quoting Bassel-Morozo, the trickster figure serves as a chaos-inducing element intent on challenging the order of things. Often tricksters star in so-called stealing fire from the gods type narratives in which they bring benefits to humankind, either heroically or by accident while they're just messing around, and act as archetypal agents of change. Tricksters are tied to thematic narratives about challenging norms and breaking rules, using their positionality on the threshold of a power structure to topple it over, often for the benefit of those who are disempowered by that structure. And most importantly, they do this with a bit of a sense of humour. So across my thesis and other work that I am doing in the academic space, I have argued that the trickster is a character type that has potentially really rich applications in stories of queer adolescence, and especially with narratives of queer adolescent rebellion. Laurie Landay defines the pop cultural tricksters in her study by, quote, their pursuit of autonomy, and Terry Waddell defines a trickster by their story role as an archetypal agent of change. That was her I was borrowing from earlier. These themes of autonomy, change, and power are also central to a lot of YA fiction. Teenagers are, after all, liminal figures, lacking legal and economic agency, as well as being caught in the marginal space between the socially constructed borders of childhood and adult. Queer teenagers are further disempowered because of the established structure that makes heterosexuality and cisgender identity as the norm, and the social, medical, and legal structures that accompany this. So, because a queer teenager is an especially liminal, vulnerable character, there is narrative pleasure and catharsis in the suggestion that maybe these marginalized characters deserve autonomy over themselves and the settings they inhabit. And not only that, but they may be the ones uniquely situated to change the world, to turn this power structure that disempowers them topsy-turvy. Not in the mode of a traditional heroic character type, but maybe through the more ambiguous, rebellious, clever, and funny figure of the Trickster, who again sits in those margins, sits outside that power structure and those binaries, and may appeal very well to queer readings. YA fiction, and especially queer YA, is thus a playful creative space in which a trickster character's antics might draw attention to structural inequities and harmful systems, all through a fantastical and playful narrative mode that has the potential to resonate strongly with a similarly marginalized audience. And so we come to Vanya herself, our case study and star of the show today. Vanya is the protagonist and narrator of Little Thieves. She's a queer YA protagonist who embodies trickster traits and demonstrates its appeal, I argue, within this genre and demographic space. So what do we know about Vanya? Vanya has been abandoned by her biological mother and adopted by the low gods of death and fortune, and she begins the novel deep in a magical identity theft scam. She seizes an opportunity to escape the abusive von Falberg household where she works as a maid, and she steals an enchanted pearl necklace and uses it to physically transform, impersonating the house's daughter, Princess Giselle. Vanya has been using this disguise to rob the nobility, but a heist goes awry when she offends a forest god by stealing the wrong thing from the wrong people. Her initially selfish schemes to try and end her curse and free herself lead Vanya to uncovering and then unraveling a magical conspiracy helmed by Giselle's abusive, warmongering fiancé, Adalbrecht. And pardon me for pronouncing these very Germanic names with an Australian accent. I don't know if I'm getting them perfect, but I'm doing my best. So, immediately we have this use of shape-shifting and subterfuge, and Vanya's liminal position between the worlds of gods and mortals, and the undermining of a much more powerful figure. All of these align Vanya with the trickster type. Following Basil Morizot's definitions, Vanya can very much be malicious, playful, or heroic, and sometimes all three at once, coming reluctantly into her heroism and then vanishing from the narrative once her good work is done. More thematically, Vanya's narrative and characterization hinge on the key aspects of liminality, autonomy, boundary crossing, playful mischief, and social critique. Her youth and her queer identity, she is asexual, intersect with her trickster traits to make her a marginal underdog figure that young readers in similar positions may identify with. So when the reader meets her, she's orchestrating this carefully plotted heist, very tricky, obviously. She employs that literal magical shapeshifting with the enchanted pearls, but also she's doing a more social, structural shapeshifting by slipping across the supposedly defined and immutable borders of class. Not only does she infiltrate the nobility, but she deliberately mocks them, exploiting their flaws and their vices to her own gain. For example, Vanya deliberately plays up her version of Giselle as a, quote, bland, unobjectionable, beautiful girl, and plays into every stereotype about vapid, uncaring princesses that she has available to her. She also orchestrates a truly wonderful con that I have chosen to call the dressing gown gambit, where she deliberately evokes taboo, flirts mercilessly, and plays herself as dumb as possible in an attempt to deflect suspicion from the person who is trying to investigate her. I won't go into all the details here, but it involves a masterful combination of breakfast food-based innuendo and subterfuge that would make many past tricksters proud, especially the lady tricksters that Landé covers in her work, who are all relying on and twisting sort of stereotypes of femininity and female stupidity to their own gain. And again, this very flirty, taboo, inappropriate goings-on is cemented as an ironic performance, given that Vanya is asexual and by her own admission has no interest in sex and is simply using it, at this point in the novel anyway, as yet another tool in her kit, and another set of social conventions to mess around with for her own gain. Now, all of this is not just for shenanigans, though. Vanya's main drive in the story is a ruthless, scheming quest for her own agency, where she's striving for a life where she can escape servitude, both to the nobles who have abused her and to her godmothers who, based on the magic system, have a sort of ownership over her, where if she asks them for help, she'll be bound to one of them. She wants to, more than anything else, determine her own fate, which resonates very strongly with the YA focus on autonomy, and of course that thematic trickster autonomy as well. And as well as this, Vanya's trickster tactics aren't just her kicking around, they're informed by a genuine sense of justice. Her sense of revenge, for example, against the von Falberg family and the other nobility that have hurt her simply because she's lower class and seen as less than human than them. While Vanya is by her own admission a selfish character, she will insist this many times across the book, she has a kind streak and ultimately emerges as a force for good, even a culture hero, like other tricksters before her. For example, she uses sleight of hand to con some pawnbrokers out of their money and their goods, returning a pawned wedding ring to a mourning widow, who is a complete stranger to Vanya at this point. Vanya downplays this good deed by telling the reader she did so, quote, accidentally on purpose. She also endangers her own life by retrieving money from a burning orphanage, again, being lower class, being in this precarious position, knowing how important gold is, unfortunately. She then leverages her liminality and her connection to the gods by securing safe passage and living quarters for the children at a temple. And finally, most climactically, she sacrifices herself to summon the godly court so they might serve justice to Adelbrecht. This element of sacrifice for the greater good of humanity is also an aspect of many Trickster tales, especially those stealing fire from the gods category that I mentioned earlier. And crucially, Trickster tales are rarely straightforward tragedies. Neither are they straightforward morality tales about this is what you must not do. Vanya's story is also not a tragedy. Her gambit pays off, and the gods bring her back to life, once again crossing those supposedly immutable borders of life and death, even more than she had already. So with Adelbrecht successfully dethroned, Vanya maintains her plan to flee the Empire, fulfilling Basil Morizot's criteria that Trickster must vanish from the world once their work is done and once they have successfully upturned the status quo. Now, in the novel's final scene, Vanya leaves Emmerich, who is the boy in these pictures here, again with the cravat. He and her have been engaged in a sort of cat and mouse sort of dynamic across the novel that gradually turns into romance. He is the victim of the dressing gown gambit at the beginning, and as the series progresses, he sort of comes to represent trying to do good through the traditional established structure of the law, whereas Vanya becomes more associated with justice more broadly outside of that structure of the law, and often emerging as a folk hero of sorts to stand up for people who fall through the cracks and are not served by that system. And this is nicely encapsulated by the end of Little Thieves, where Vanya leaves Emmerich handcuffed to a bench and playfully, fondly invites him to come and catch her. Their mutual chase continues into the sequels, and again, as I said, Vanya leans much more constantly and consciously and determinedly into her trickster tactics. In her own words, she realizes that she likes solving problems for good people by causing problems for bad people. She comes to this realization in the second book, Painted Devils, and, as I mentioned before, emerges as a full-on folk hero in Holy Terrors, which establishes some of the conflict going forward. So, to conclude, given the shared themes between Trickster tales and queer young adult, and stories of queer adolescence more broadly, the Trickster figure might resonate deeply with a marginalised teenage audience because of all of their shared themes and their shared sort of narrative functions. Writers working in this space might make good use of a Trickster protagonist to craft fun, anarchic, cathartic narratives for their young queer readers. In Little Thieves, Owen has constructed an effective example of a queer YA trickster character, a marginalised, boundary-crossing, shape-shifting figure who represents liminality, duality, subversion, and irony, and who uses humour, trickery, and mischief to undermine the dominant powers that be and create, quote, a new order born out of mischief and play, before vanishing from the world. And now it is time for me to vanish once my work is done. So thank you so much for listening along, and I will see you very soon in the question time.